The morning on Hian Reach arrived gently, as if it did not want to disturb anyone. Light spread across the valley in slow gold bands, touching the tops of the orchard trees first, then the white stone paths, then the roofs of the little homes tucked between gardens and low-flowering walls. The sky above the colony was a pale, washed blue, brushed here and there with thin drifting clouds that looked too lazy to belong to any weather worth worrying about. A breeze moved in from the eastern ridge carrying the smell of damp soil, cut grass, and the faint salt tang of the inland lake beyond the terraces. It was the kind of morning people imagined when they talked about earning peace. Along the outer path, the birds had already started. They were not native to Hian Reach. They had come from Earth decades ago in fragile transport habitats, bright feathered things with quick wings and cheerful songs, imported by the first settlers because somebody had once decided that a colony did not truly feel like home until something small sang in the trees at sunrise. Over the years they had multiplied, built nests in the orchard rows, and made the mornings feel older and kinder than they really were. Mara Voss was kneeling in the dirt when the first full light reached her garden. She was 81 years old, though she disliked saying the number aloud because people always reacted to it instead of to her. Her hair was silver white and cut short enough to stay out of her eyes when she worked. The skin of her hands was lined and sun-darkened, the knuckles broad, the veins visible. Her right knee ached with a dull and familiar complaint every time she leaned too far forward, and the fingers on her left hand were slower than they had once been in cold weather. She accepted these things the way she accepted gravity and winter. They were not insults. They were receipts. Her left arm, from the elbow down, was prosthetic. It was an old model, titanium housing, matte finish long since worn smooth in places by decades of use. Scratches crossed the metal in pale lines. The wrist joint clicked faintly when she rotated it at certain angles. The newer replacement options were lighter, smarter, faster, more responsive, and had been offered to her repeatedly over the last 12 years by well-meaning physicians, administrators, and one particularly persistent technician from the Colonial Medical Authority. She had refused every single time. This arm had learned her. That mattered. She pressed a seed into the soil with the tip of one finger, covered it carefully, moved a few inches down the row, and planted the next. Her motions were unhurried, not because she was weak, but because hurry had become unnecessary here. The garden did not reward speed. It rewarded attention. Sun, water, patience. A person could respect that. Behind her, Hian Reach was waking by degrees. The colony stretched in a wide crescent along the side of the valley, built around a central common house with broad windows and a low-tiled roof that glowed amber in the dawn. Paths wound outward from it like spokes, connecting rows of cottages, medical rooms, workshops, shaded sitting courts, and greenhouses tucked into the slope. Solar glass shimmered faintly on rooftops. Vines climbed trellises. Benches stood under fruit trees heavy with leaves. Somewhere farther up the hill, a wind chime moved once in the breeze and then settled again. Nothing in the place looked temporary. That had been important to the people who built it. Hian Reach had not been designed as a holding station or a transit post or one more practical stop in the endless machinery of human expansion. It had been built as a final place. A place for people who had already spent too much of their lives in metal corridors, command decks, bunk rooms, field camps, orbital docks, and settlements where the walls had always felt one crisis away from failure. People came to Hian Reach to stop bracing. At least that was the idea. Mara sat back slightly on her heels and glanced toward the next terrace down, where old Jalen Richter was already on his porch with a blanket over his knees and a mug in both hands. He always rose before the sun and always drank the same bitter black tea from the same chipped blue cup. Nobody knew why he preferred that cup when the colony kitchen had provided him with 6 newer ones over the years. Nobody asked anymore. Across the path from him, the curtains in Lynn Serrano's front window had just been pulled open. A light came on in her kitchen, warm and yellow. Farther off, near the western greenhouse, 2 support drones glided along the path carrying crates of nutrient mix for the vegetable beds, their motors so quiet they sounded like insects. The whole colony had that particular softness that belongs only to places where nobody expects violence. Mara turned back to her work. The bed she was planting ran along the southern wall of her small house, where it got the best light through most of the day. Beans in the far row. Leaf greens nearest the wall. Root vegetables in the deeper section. The seeds she held in the dish beside her were small, plain, and entirely unimpressive to look at, each one no more than a dry little promise. She liked them for that. Great things, in her experience, were usually built out of unimpressive beginnings and the stubborn refusal to quit halfway through. She set another seed into the soil. From somewhere up the path came the slow rhythmic sound of measured footsteps. She knew who it would be before she looked. Dr. Elias Morn emerged from between two hedges, walking with the careful upright posture of a man who had once spent decades telling other people to stay alive and had only recently admitted that he ought to take some of his own advice. He was 86, tall in the way very thin men remain tall even after age took some of their height, and he carried a small satchel though he was technically retired and had no formal clinic hours anymore. He saw Mara and lifted 2 fingers in greeting. "Too early for sane gardening," he called quietly. "Too early for unsolicited medical commentary," Mara replied. He smiled, the expression deepening the lines around his eyes. "Your knee again?" "My knee and I have reached an understanding. That never ends well. Depends which of us dies first." Elias gave a short laugh, shook his head, and kept walking toward the lower residences where, Mara knew, somebody had probably woken with a stiff shoulder or a blood pressure complaint or a machine assist brace that needed adjusting. Retirement had changed his schedule. It had not changed his nature. That was true of many people on Hian Reach. The colony had just over 2,700 residents and perhaps 100 additional staff, aides, techs, and maintenance workers, most of them decades younger than the people they served. The average resident age was a little over 79. Some used canes. Some used powered mobility supports that hummed softly at the joints. Some had lungs that were not original, eyes that were not original, or bones threaded through with smart reinforcement mesh from surgeries performed under harsh skies on worlds far less forgiving than this one. To an outsider, it would have looked like fragility. To the people who lived there, it looked like mileage. A pair of children's voices rose briefly from near the orchard, grandchildren visiting one of the residents for the season, no doubt, followed by an adult shushing them with the useless gentleness adults always used when they knew perfectly well the children would ignore them. Someone in the distance started a music player low enough that only the bass line carried in the wind. The lake beyond the eastern ridge flashed silver through a break in the trees. Mara finished one row and shifted to the next. When she leaned back this time, she let herself rest for a moment and simply looked. At the colony. At the terraces. At the common house. At the roofs catching more light now as the sun climbed. At the calm geometry of a place built for long breakfasts, afternoon card games, stubborn roses, shared meals, old arguments repeated with affection, and evenings quiet enough that a person could hear the insects begin. There had been a time in her life when she had not believed such places really existed. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say she had not believed they lasted. That thought came and went without staying long. She did not invite such thoughts in the garden. The garden had its own logic. Put your hands in the soil. Do the task in front of you. Let memory remain where it belongs unless it is useful. She reached for another seed. Above her, a flock of the imported birds lifted suddenly from the trees near the central path, wheeled once in the brightening air, and settled again farther down the ridge. Mara noticed the movement, then the silence that followed it for half a second before the birds resumed singing. Her metal fingers closed gently around the next seed. The morning remained golden. The wind remained soft. Hian Reach continued waking in peace, slow and orderly and unworried, as though nothing in the whole wide galaxy had any intention of disturbing it. And for one more little while, that was true. Hian Reach had never been intended to be impressive. That was deliberate. When the Human Colonial Authority approved its construction 38 years earlier, the planners had not imagined it as a symbol of prestige or technological triumph. It was not meant to compete with the gleaming orbital cities around the core worlds or the vast terraformed capitals that glittered across the inner colonies. Hian Reach was something quieter. It was built for people who were finished with being impressive. The valley had been chosen carefully, A small moon on the outer edge of a modest system, warm enough to support open-air farming, stable enough to require only minimal atmospheric maintenance, and distant enough from major trade routes that traffic rarely passed close enough to disturb the sky. The architects had avoided tall structures. Instead, the colony spread outward rather than upward. Low homes of pale stone and solar glass. Curving paths. Gardens everywhere. Community gardens, personal gardens, rooftop gardens, greenhouse rows along the western ridge. At the center stood the common hall, where most residents gathered for evening meals, music nights, lectures, or the occasional loud argument over board games that had somehow survived centuries of human expansion unchanged. From orbit, Hian Reach looked like a scatter of white petals across a green valley. Peaceful. Harmless. Which, according to every official description, it was. The colony charter defined it clearly. Retirement settlement for long-service personnel of the Human Colonial Authority and affiliated organizations. People came here when their contracts ended, when their bodies no longer tolerated high-gravity postings, when their reflexes slowed just enough that younger officers replaced them, when decades of service had earned them something simple in return. Of the roughly 2,700 residents living in Hian Reach, the youngest was 64. The oldest was 92 and still insisted on tending a row of citrus trees that nobody else was allowed to touch. The average age sat just under 80. Many residents moved slowly. Along the paths that morning, several people walked with canes or mobility supports that carried part of their weight. One man rolled past in a chair powered by a compact anti-grav system that hummed quietly beneath the seat. A woman paused every dozen steps to adjust the brace around her knee before continuing toward the greenhouse. Prosthetic limbs were common. So were old scars. Eyes replaced by polished optical lenses that caught the sunlight in faint glints. Fingers that ended in reinforced mechanical joints. One resident near the eastern orchard had a shoulder assembly built almost entirely from alloy and carbon fiber, the result of a mining accident 30 years earlier on a world whose name most people had forgotten. None of this made the colony look dangerous. If anything, it made Hian Reach look fragile. The residents were old. They moved carefully. Their voices carried the dry humor and quiet patience of people who had lived long enough to stop pretending they were indestructible. In the early mornings like this one, the paths filled slowly. Old friends walking together before breakfast. A pair of former cargo pilots arguing in low voices about orbital approach techniques they had not actually used in decades. 3 women seated on a bench beside the irrigation canal, comparing notes about which fertilizer blend worked best for root vegetables in the valley soil. A tall man with white hair and a permanent stoop spent an hour every day sweeping the central courtyard with a broom, even though the automated cleaners did a better job 10 minutes later. Nobody stopped him. Everyone understood that the broom was not about cleaning. It was about routine. Routine mattered in a place like this. Because Hian Reach was filled with people who had once lived lives where routine had been impossible. Near the northern slope, Dr. Elias Morn reached the home of Suki Tanaka and tapped twice on the doorframe before entering. He did not wait for an answer. He never did. Inside, Suki sat in a chair by the window with one foot resting on a stool and a blanket draped across her knees. Her hair had been black once, though the years had reduced it to a soft silver cloud around her face. She looked up as Elias stepped in. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Elias replied, already kneeling beside the stool to examine her ankle. "What did you do to it this time?" "Nothing." That answer has historically been inaccurate. "I watered the tomatoes." Elias lifted the ankle gently and rotated it once. The joint creaked softly. "Tomatoes are aggressive plants," he said. "They attack when provoked." She snorted. "You're not funny." "I've been told that many times." He examined the joint for another moment, then nodded to himself. "Inflammation," he said. "Nothing dramatic. Ice pack. Compression bandage. Stay off it for a day. I was planning to weed the north beds." "You were planning to make it worse." Suki sighed with theatrical suffering. "Fine. One day." Elias finished wrapping the ankle with practiced hands. For 30 years he had worked as a combat surgeon in forward deployment hospitals scattered across 4-star systems. He had operated in mud, dust, vacuum-sealed field tents, and once inside the cargo hold of a damaged freighter that had been drifting without gravity for 8 hours. Compared to those environments, a quiet living room with sunlight through the window felt almost absurdly gentle. He tied the bandage and stood slowly, stretching his back. "Breakfast in the hall today?" Suki asked. "Unless someone invents a more interesting medical emergency. Give it time." Elias smiled. On Halcyon Reach, small injuries were treated with the same calm attention as battlefield trauma once had been. Old habits did not disappear. They simply changed scale. Across the valley, another resident moved through the morning in a very different way. Yuta Koran was already finishing her exercise routine. She stood in the open grass field beyond the last row of cottages, feet planted wide, arms moving slowly through a sequence of controlled motions that looked almost like dance but were not dance at all. Each turn of her shoulders was deliberate. Each step measured. She was 78. Shorter than most people expected when they first met her. Her hair was tied back in a tight gray braid, and her eyes moved constantly, tracking the wind across the grass, the birds lifting from the orchard, the distant figures along the main path. She had spent 31 years in special operations. The official records listed most of those deployments as classified logistical support. That description had never been particularly accurate. Yuta finished the last movement in the sequence and rolled her shoulders once, loosening the joints. Her knees complained slightly, though not enough to matter. She began walking back toward the colony at an even pace. As she passed the tree line, the birds fell quiet again for a moment before resuming their song. She noticed. She always noticed things like that. But there was nothing in the sky except thin clouds drifting above the valley, so she filed the observation away and continued walking. Old instincts also did not disappear. They simply waited. Far below the surface of Halcyon Reach, another resident had already been awake for hours. Petra Solis preferred the underground levels. She claimed it was because the tunnels stayed cooler than the surface houses during the warmer months. This explanation was technically true, though not entirely complete. The maintenance corridor where she worked that morning smelled faintly of machine oil and heated metal. Tools were arranged in precise rows along a workbench. A diagnostic screen glowed beside her elbow while she leaned over an open access panel, tightening a connection in the colony's secondary power relay system. Petra was 83. Broad-shouldered. Thick-armed. Her gray hair cropped so short it looked almost military. Her hands carried permanent stains of grease and conductive dust that never quite washed away no matter how carefully she scrubbed. Before retiring to Halcyon Reach, she had spent 40 years in the Colonial Engineering Corps designing propulsion systems for deep-range warships. 3 of those ships were still in service somewhere beyond the frontier. Petra did not talk about them much. What she talked about instead were load tolerances, energy conversion ratios, tunnel stability, and the dozens of small mechanical improvements she had quietly made to the colony infrastructure over the past decade. Officially, she was not in charge of anything anymore. Unofficially, almost every structural system beneath Halcyon Reach had been touched by her work. She finished tightening the relay connection, wiped her hands on a cloth, and checked the readout one last time. Satisfied, she closed the panel. Above her, sunlight continued spreading across the valley. Below her, machines hummed steadily in the dark. At the lake on the far side of the ridge, Admiral Cormac Drays sat in a folding chair with a fishing rod resting lightly in his hands. He was 89, the oldest resident in Halcyon Reach. His hair had gone completely white years ago, and his face carried the weathered lines of a man who had spent more time staring at stars than at mirrors. A thermos of coffee stood beside his chair on the grass. The lake was quiet that morning. The water lay flat and clear, reflecting the pale sky and the line of hills beyond the valley. Drays watched the surface with patient attention. 40 years earlier he had commanded an 11-ship fleet during the Reach Corridor conflict, a 3-day engagement that had stopped a hostile advance and saved 4 colonies from occupation. He had received more medals than he could remember and delivered speeches in halls large enough to echo. Now he spent most mornings here. Fishing. The line dipped slightly. He lifted the rod, reeled slowly, and brought up a broad silver fish that flickered in the sunlight. "Morning," he said to it. Then he dropped it gently into the bucket beside his chair and cast the line again. Peace suited him. Most of the residents of Hian Reach felt the same. They had worked long lives in difficult places. They had survived wars, disasters, negotiations, engineering crises, and the slow grind of building civilization across hostile worlds. Now they were old. Now they moved more slowly. Now they planted gardens and brewed tea and argued about fertilizer ratios and watched birds in the trees. To anyone looking at Hian Reach from the outside, the conclusion would have been obvious. This was a colony full of harmless people. And that conclusion would have been the first mistake anyone ever made about them. By mid-morning, Hian Reach had settled into the rhythm it followed every day. Breakfast in the common hall. Slow walks along the terraces. Repairs to garden irrigation lines that probably did not need repairing but were satisfying to adjust anyway. People spoke in the easy tone of long familiarity. Some had lived on the colony since its founding. Others had arrived later, carried here by the quiet gravity of a place where nobody expected anything dramatic to happen ever again. The younger support staff moved through the routines efficiently, though many of them had long ago noticed something about the residents that was difficult to describe. It was not just that the retirees had impressive pasts. It was the way they moved. Even now. Even slowly. Even with aching joints and replaced limbs. There was a steadiness to them. A kind of invisible structure beneath the calm surface of their lives. Most of the staff had stopped trying to explain it. Inside the common hall, Mara Voss finished a late breakfast of tea and bread while sunlight poured through the tall windows. Around her, nearly 200 residents filled the tables. Some were reading. Some were playing quiet strategy games. A group near the far wall had already begun arguing about whether the colony council should expand the northern greenhouse. The arguments were calm but extremely serious. Mara listened without really listening. Across from her sat Ryan Holt, who had spent 22 years as a logistics coordinator for long-range supply fleets. In retirement, he had become deeply passionate about orchard management and now possessed detailed opinions about apple trees that nobody had asked for. "You planted the late beans again," he said, nodding toward the dirt under her fingernails. "They grow better in the southern light. You planted them 2 weeks too late. They still grow. That's not the point." "It is absolutely the point." He opened his mouth to argue further, then paused. The pause lasted less than a second. But Mara noticed. She always noticed. Ryan's eyes had drifted to the wide window beside their table. Not in distraction. In assessment. Mara followed his gaze automatically. Outside, the sky remained clear. The valley remained calm. But something about the moment had shifted slightly, like a faint vibration running through a surface too subtle for most people to detect. She did not react. Instead, she took another sip of tea. Ryan looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. Across the hall, a tall woman with a mobility brace on one leg was teaching 2 younger staff members how to repair a small agricultural drone. Her name was Celine Mora. Before retirement, she had served as a field engineer on 5 frontier colonies where infrastructure failures had often meant the difference between survival and extinction. Now she ran informal repair workshops twice a week because she claimed it kept her mind sharp. "Never trust a diagnostic scan by itself," she was saying while adjusting a tool against the drone's casing. "Machines lie when they're tired." The younger technician blinked. "Machines lie." Celine shrugged. "Bad wiring. Heat fatigue. Signal bleed. It all looks like honesty until you check it properly." She removed the casing panel and tapped a connector with the end of her wrench. The drone hummed back to life instantly. "There?" she said. "Honesty restored." The younger technician stared. "Why didn't the scan catch that?" Celine smiled faintly. "Because the scan didn't grow up fixing equipment in vacuum storms." On the lower terrace near the irrigation canal, Yuta Karan had stopped walking. She stood beside the path, watching the sky. Not staring. Just observing. A maintenance drone passed overhead, gliding toward the greenhouse. Beyond it, nothing moved except the drifting clouds. Still, she remained there another 10 seconds before continuing. A woman watering plants nearby glanced up. "Something wrong?" "No," Yuta said. Then after a moment she added, "Probably nothing." She resumed walking. But the quiet unease stayed with her. Below ground, Petra Solis had moved deeper into the engineering tunnels. A large schematic glowed across the wall screen in front of her, showing the colony's infrastructure grid, power lines, tunnel routes, atmospheric circulation, storage areas. Hian Reach had originally been built with only basic underground support systems. Petra had spent the last 12 years expanding them. Some of the changes had been officially approved. Others had simply appeared over time because Petra believed strongly that good engineering rarely benefited from too much discussion. Reinforced tunnel walls. Backup power loops. Air recyclers capable of running independently for months. Maintenance passages connecting nearly every major building on the surface. She had once explained the upgrades to the Colony Council as earthquake preparation. Technically that had been true. But earthquakes were not the only disasters Petra Solis had learned to prepare for during 40 years in the Colonial Engineering Corps. She ran a diagnostic check across the grid. Everything looked stable. Satisfied, she turned away from the display. But not before saving the current configuration to a private backup file she kept separate from the official colony records. She always did that. Old habits. At the lake, Admiral Drays reeled in another fish. He dropped it gently into the bucket beside his chair and poured himself another cup of coffee. A young maintenance worker passed by along the ridge path and waved. "Morning, Admiral." Drays lifted 2 fingers in return. The worker hesitated. "Can I ask something?" "You already are. Is it true you once commanded 11 warships at once?" Drays considered the question. "Technically 12, he said. 12. One of them was very small." The worker laughed. "Must have been exciting." Drays looked back at the lake. "Exciting isn't the word I'd choose." "What would you choose?" Drays watched the fishing line ripple across the water. Then he said quietly, "Necessary." The worker nodded, though he did not fully understand. Few people did. War always looked different from a distance. Back at the common hall, Mara finished her tea. Around her, the conversations continued. People spoke about weather patterns, crop rotations, the music night planned for Friday, and whether the colony kitchen should finally retire the old coffee machines that occasionally produced something closer to engine coolant. It was an ordinary morning. But beneath the ordinary surface lived something else. A lifetime of experience spread across nearly 3,000 people. Fleet commanders, engineers, doctors, intelligence analysts, pilots, demolition specialists, logistics planners, communications experts, security officers, people who had spent decades solving problems in places where failure meant death. Now they were old. Now they planted gardens. Now they walked slowly along quiet paths. But knowledge did not disappear just because someone retired. Skill did not vanish with age. And instinct, especially the kind built over a lifetime of surviving difficult places, never truly went away. It simply waited. Hian Reach was filled with people like that, which meant that if trouble ever came to this peaceful valley, it would not find helpless victims. It would find something else entirely, something the rest of the galaxy had largely forgotten. And soon, very soon, something in the dark beyond the system was going to learn that lesson the hard way. Far beyond the quiet valley of Hian Reach, space was not peaceful. It only looked that way. In the black distance past the outer boundary of the system, 12 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a staggered formation that rippled briefly across the void like stones striking still water. The distortion faded. The stars returned. The fleet was suddenly there. The ships were not large by the standards of the major galactic powers, but they were more than large enough for the task ahead of them. Long angular hulls plated in dark alloy drifted into position around a heavier central cruiser whose command arrays glittered faintly under the light of the distant star. The vessels belonged to the Veery Dominion, a mid-tier interstellar power that had spent the last 20 years expanding quietly along the outer frontier. The Veery did not conquer loudly. They preferred efficiency. Their expansion policy relied on three tools used in careful sequence: diplomacy, economic pressure, force. The first two had been attempted in the Cathra system several times over the past decade. Neither had produced the result the Dominion wanted. So the third tool had now arrived. Inside the command deck of the cruiser Vicus Arum, Fleet Admiral Terek Sol adjusted the display before him and studied the planet rotating slowly across the tactical screen. Cathra 4. A small mining moon. Minimal defenses. Low population density. No nearby fleet presence. A perfect opportunity. Around him, officers moved quietly between consoles, updating data feeds and aligning the fleet into orbital approach positions. System scans complete, one of them reported. No patrol craft detected. Expected, Terex replied calmly. Another officer leaned toward the sensor array. Surface settlement located. A cluster of lights appeared on the tactical map, marking the valley where Hian Reach lay. Population estimate, 2,700. Civilian infrastructure. Agricultural terraces. Energy grid minimal. Industrial activity, low. The Admiral nodded. Confirm intelligence file. A data screen expanded beside the map. The report had been prepared months earlier by Dominion analysts. It was thorough. Very thorough. Target, Hian Reach Retirement Colony. Population, retired human personnel and support staff. Average biological age, 78 years. Military assets, none detected. Orbital defenses, none. Surface weapons, none. Fleet presence within system, none. Strategic value of colony itself, minimal. Strategic value of system resources, high. The moon's crust contained unusually rich deposits of iridium-class minerals used in advanced propulsion systems. The deposits had been quietly surveyed years earlier. The Dominion wanted them, and the colony sitting above them represented the only obstacle. A very small obstacle. The Veery Operations Council had debated the mission for less than 30 minutes before approving it. Their reasoning was simple. The moon held valuable resources. The humans living there were old. Not soldiers. Not active personnel. Retirees. Many with prosthetics. Many with reduced mobility. Many well past the age of combat relevance. The analysts had estimated 90 minutes would be sufficient to secure the colony and establish Dominion control. A small landing force. Minimal bombardment. Occupation completed before any neighboring systems could react. Efficient. Profitable. On the bridge, Admiral Terex finished reading the report again. He did not doubt it. Human intelligence files were generally reliable. Humans were known for documenting everything in obsessive detail, which made their records extremely useful when planning operations like this one. Deploy landing force in standard pattern, he said. 12 transport carriers began moving forward from the fleet formation. Inside them waited 4,000 Veery soldiers. Well-trained. Equipped with modern combat armor and pulse weaponry designed for planetary pacification. They had been briefed on the target. A retirement colony. Minimal resistance expected. The soldiers treated the assignment as routine. Some of them joked during the final equipment checks. Others ran weapon diagnostics with board efficiency. One squad leader asked his commander if they were truly deploying 4,000 troops against a population of elderly civilians. The commander shrugged. Procedure. The soldier nodded. Procedure was procedure. Back on the cruiser, another officer glanced at the tactical map. Recommend preliminary bombardment, Admiral. Of course. Standard doctrine. Even minimal resistance was easier to deal with after orbital softening. Admiral Terex issued the order without hesitation. 3 warships shifted formation and angled their forward batteries toward the moon below. Energy built slowly in the weapon systems. Not enough to destroy the colony entirely. Just enough to shatter key structures. Disable infrastructure. Remove any possibility of organized resistance. Then the landing force would arrive. The colony would surrender. The mineral fields would belong to the Dominion. Everything about the operation made sense. There was only one small problem with the intelligence report. The analysts who wrote it had measured the residents of Hian Reach using the metrics most civilizations use to evaluate threat. Physical capability, current military status, active weapons, fleet presence. On paper, the colony was harmless. But the analysts had never asked the most important question. Not once. They had not asked what those 2,700-old humans had spent their lives doing before they retired. They had not asked how many wars they had survived, how many fleets they had commanded, how many disasters they had engineered solutions for, how many impossible situations they had already walked through and lived. They had not asked how many of them had once been among the most dangerous people in human space. Because that information had not seemed relevant. After all, they were retired. So, harmless. The Veery Dominion had built its entire operation around that assumption. And now their fleet was descending toward Hian Reach with absolute confidence that nothing down there could stop them. Back in the quiet valley below, the morning continued. Birds sang. The wind moved gently across the terraces. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of the colony, a system that almost nobody remembered still existed quietly continued scanning the outer system. Watching. Waiting. Because one resident of Hian Reach had never believed that peace was permanent. And she had prepared accordingly. The satellite had been in orbit for 26 years. Most people on Hian Reach had forgotten it existed. That was understandable. It had been launched during the early construction of the colony when the human colonial authorities still followed standard frontier protocol. Every new settlement received a small orbital watch platform, part navigation beacon, part early warning system, part communications relay. It was a routine precaution for young colonies still vulnerable to accidents, piracy, or stray traffic drifting through the wrong part of space. Normally those satellites were decommissioned after 10 or 15 years. Once a colony proved stable and traffic patterns became predictable, the maintenance cost outweighed the risk. Hian Reach had officially scheduled its satellite for retirement 12 years earlier. The paperwork had even been filed. The removal request had simply never been completed, because Petra Solis had quietly overridden it. She had done so without argument, without announcement, and without asking permission. She had simply rerouted the maintenance authority to her engineering terminal, run the diagnostic updates herself every few months, and replaced 2 aging sensor modules with spare components salvaged from obsolete mining equipment. The satellite still worked. Not perfectly, but well enough. Which meant that at 3:02 colony time, it saw something. Out beyond the outer boundary of the system, space distorted. A brief ripple. Then another. Then 12 more. The satellite sensors recorded the energy signatures automatically and passed the data through the classification software Petra had written herself during one long night several years earlier when she had been unable to sleep. The program did not require much processing time. It identified the arrivals in less than 3 seconds. FTL emergence. Multiple vessels. Formation pattern, military. Vector, inward trajectory toward Cathra 4. Estimated arrival time. 4 hours, 11 minutes. The satellite sent the alert immediately, but not to the colony network, not to the public broadcast systems. Petra had designed it differently. The warning went to 6 personal communicators. Only 6. The first of those devices rested on the workbench in Petra's underground engineering bay. It vibrated once. A single sharp tone followed. Petra looked down at it. For a moment she did not move. Then she wiped her hands on a cloth, picked up the communicator, and studied the screen. The display showed a simplified tactical feed. 12 contacts. Long-range scan silhouettes. Flight pattern analysis. And at the bottom of the screen, the line she had hoped she would never see. Estimated arrival, for 11 hours. Petra stared at it another moment. Then she exhaled slowly. Well, she muttered to the empty tunnel. So it finally happened. She tapped the confirmation key. The satellite continued transmitting updates. The second communicator buzzed in Mara Voss's garden. She had returned there after breakfast to finish the planting she had started earlier that morning. The vibration came through the pocket of her work jacket. Mara paused, hand resting on the soil. The tone that followed was quiet. but unmistakable. She removed the communicator and looked at the screen. 12 ship icons rotated slowly across the display. She read the data once. Then again. Her expression did not change. But her shoulders straightened slightly. 4 hours. That was not much time. She brushed dirt from her hands and stood carefully, her knee complaining as it always did when she rose too quickly. For a moment she looked up at the sky. It was still pale blue. Still peaceful. Still completely unaware that something very unpleasant was approaching from beyond the system. Then Mara lowered her gaze and opened the communication channel. The third communicator rang in Dr. Elias Morn's kitchen. He had just finished brewing a fresh pot of tea and was flipping through a medical journal when the alert appeared. Elias frowned at the sound. That tone belonged to a channel he had not heard in many years. He answered immediately. "Morn." "Mara," the voice said. He recognized it instantly. "Morning," he replied. There was a brief pause. Then Mara said 3 words. 12 ships inbound. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Elias did not ask if she was joking. He did not ask if she was certain. Those questions belonged to people with less experience. Instead he looked out the kitchen window at the quiet path outside his house. "How long?" he asked. "For hours." Another pause. Then Elias nodded once, though Mara could not see him. "I'll prepare the medical bay." "Thank you." The connection closed. Elias set the communicator down beside his tea. He finished the cup calmly. Then he stood up and began gathering supplies. The fourth communicator activated while Yuta Karan was walking along the lower terrace path. She stopped instantly when the vibration touched her wrist. The screen illuminated. She read the alert in less than a second. Her eyes moved once across the sky. Then back to the display. When the call came through from Mara, she answered before the second ring. "How many?" Yuta asked. 12. "Timeline?" "4 hours." Yuta nodded slightly. "Understood." She ended the call. And immediately turned toward the colony center at a pace that looked unhurried to anyone watching. But it was the fastest pace her joints could comfortably maintain. The fifth communicator sat beside Admiral Draza's coffee thermos at the lake. It buzzed just as his fishing line dipped beneath the water. He lifted the rod automatically, reeled, pulled another fish from the lake, then glanced down at the communicator. He read the alert. Then he looked up at the sky. Then back at the screen. "Ah," he said quietly. The call from Mara arrived moments later. "How many?" he asked. 12. Another fish splashed back into the water as Draze released it. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. He did not sound angry. He sounded mildly inconvenienced. Like a man whose quiet morning had been interrupted by something he had always known might eventually happen. The sixth communicator belonged to Petra's backup contact in the Colony Council. But Petra had already triggered the secondary alert system before that call even arrived. Across Hian Reach, hidden signals began activating quietly inside systems the residents had not used in decades. Emergency lighting circuits. Underground access doors. Internal communication channels. Not alarms. Not yet. Just readiness. Petra looked once more at the satellite data scrolling across her display. The 12 ships were already adjusting formation. Their trajectory was clear. They were coming directly toward the moon. She tapped a key on her console. Above the colony, the aging satellite adjusted its sensors and focused its array more precisely on the incoming fleet. Every movement, every energy spike, every formation change. Petra intended to know exactly what they were doing. In her garden, Mara Voss clipped the prosthetic arm back into place at her shoulder. The locking mechanism clicked softly. It had been many years since she had needed it for anything more serious than gardening. But the motion still felt familiar. She glanced once more at the seeds resting in the soil. Then she turned toward the colony center. 4 hours. That was not much time. But it was enough. Enough to gather people. Enough to prepare. Enough to remind 3,000 retired humans exactly who they had once been. And exactly what they still were. Behind her, the birds continued singing in the trees. Above them, 12 warships crossed silently through the dark toward Cathra 4. The countdown had begun. Mara reached the central hall in less than 5 minutes. She was not the first. Yuta Karan stood near the main entrance already, arms folded loosely across her chest while she watched the path outside. She did not look worried. She looked focused, the way a person looks when a situation has finally confirmed something they had suspected for years. "You saw it," Mara said. Yuta nodded once. 12 ships. Combat formation. 4 hours, Yuta added. Neither of them wasted time discussing possibilities. They both understood what the formation meant. Behind them, the wide doors of the common hall slid open and Petra Solis stepped inside, still carrying the grease-stained cloth she had used in the engineering tunnels. Her expression held none of the surprise someone unfamiliar with frontier life might have shown. She simply said, "Satellite confirms the vector. They're coming straight in." Mara nodded. "Drays?" "On his way," Yuta said. As if summoned by the conversation, the outer doors opened again. Cormac Drays walked inside with the relaxed pace of someone arriving slightly late to a meeting he had expected for years. He held his fishing rod in one hand, the bucket of fish in the other. He placed both beside the door before approaching the others. "How bad?" he asked. 12 warships, Mara replied. Drays considered that ambitious. Within 15 minutes the colony-wide alert was issued. Not a siren. Not a screaming emergency signal. Just a calm voice over the internal communications network. "This is a colony advisory. All residents please proceed to the central hall. This is not a drill." People came. Slowly at first. Then steadily. Doors opened across Hian Reach. Figures appeared along the paths. Old men leaning on canes. Women walking with mechanical braces humming quietly at their knees. Residents in loose morning clothes. Others already dressed for the day. A few arrived in powered mobility frames that lifted part of their weight with quiet mechanical assistance. No one ran. No one shouted. They simply walked toward the hall. Because every person in Hian Reach had lived long enough to understand something about emergencies. Panic wastes time. By the time the sun climbed above the eastern ridge, nearly 3,000 people filled the hall. Some stood. Some sat. Some rested on mobility supports. But every seat and every corner of the wide room held someone waiting quietly. The younger support staff looked confused. One of them whispered to another, "Why isn't anyone panicking?" The second worker glanced around the room. At the calm faces. The steady posture. The quiet conversations. Then she said softly, "I think they've all been through worse." Mara stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall. The room quieted almost immediately. Not because she demanded it, because the people there recognized leadership when they saw it. She did not waste words. 12 Veery warships entered the system 3 hours ago, she said. A faint ripple moved through the room. But it was not fear. It was recognition. They will arrive over Cathra 4 in roughly 4 hours. Still no panic. Just attention. Their objective is almost certainly the mineral fields beneath this colony. She paused briefly. Their intelligence likely describes us as a retirement settlement with no military capability. A quiet chuckle rose from somewhere in the back rows. Mara allowed herself the smallest smile. "Yes," she said. "That was also my impression." The chuckle spread across the hall. Then faded again. She continued. "They will begin with orbital bombardment." Heads nodded throughout the room. Not in surprise. In agreement. That is standard procedure. Then she added calmly, "We will allow them to." The plan was explained quickly. Because simple plans survive contact with reality better than complicated ones. Phase 1. Evacuate the surface. Everyone underground. Petra's tunnels and reinforced chambers had enough space for the entire colony. Phase 2. Let the bombardment destroy the surface structures. Buildings could be rebuilt. People could not. Phase 3. When the landing force arrives. Mara paused. She looked across the hall at the thousands of faces watching her. Then she finished the sentence. "We greet them." A low murmur passed through the room. Not fear. Anticipation. Then something remarkable happened. No assignments were given. Instead, people simply stood up and began claiming roles. A tall man with a mechanical hip walked to the front table. "Structural engineer," he said. "I'll assist Petra." A woman with 3 prosthetic fingers raised her hand. "Drone maintenance." 2 men in their late 80s approached the explosives inventory terminal. "Demolition specialists." Someone near the back called out, "Communications." Another voice, "Medical support." Within minutes, the hall had transformed from a gathering into an operations center. Tables filled with people coordinating tasks. Groups forming automatically. Everyone knew exactly where they were most useful, because every one of them had done something like this before. Dr. Elias Morn converted the colony clinic into a field medical station in under 20 minutes. He moved through the room with calm efficiency. "Trauma beds here. Sterile packs on that counter. Mobility frame repair station there." 8 former medics joined him without being asked. None of them spoke much. They simply began preparing. Yuta Karan disappeared into the tunnel network with a small team. When she returned half an hour later, she carried a mental map of every piece of equipment available. Mining drills, construction mechs, survey drones, explosives, transport vehicles. Everything. She delivered the information to Mara in short, precise sentences. Then she went back underground again, already planning how the tunnels would be used. Petra Solis was smiling. Not a happy smile. A satisfied one. She had spent 12 years quietly reinforcing the colony infrastructure. Now she was about to find out if her work had been good enough. "Mining rigs can be repositioned," she said. "Atmospheric processors can be modified. Survey drones can carry payloads." She tapped a schematic on the table. "Tunnels connect every structure on the surface." Drays studied the display. Then he nodded. "Good." Cormac Drays took control of the tactical coordination table. He did not announce it. He simply began working. Someone placed a star map in front of him. Another person brought sensor data from the satellite. Within minutes he had drawn the Veery fleet formation on a data pad. "Cautious commander," he murmured. "How can you tell?" someone asked. "They brought 12 ships to attack Gardeners." A few people chuckled. Drays continued writing. Calculating angles, vectors, timing. His mind slipped easily into patterns he had not needed for years. Old habits, old instincts, old wars. Meanwhile, the evacuation proceeded. Residents moved into the underground tunnels in organized groups. Some walked slowly. Some rode mobility frames. Some helped neighbors whose joints were worse than their own. Nobody complained. Nobody hesitated. Above them, the sky remained blue. The birds still sang. But deep in the valley beneath Hian Reach, 3,000 elderly humans were preparing for war with quiet professional efficiency. Because retirement did not erase experience. And age did not erase skill. The Veery Dominion had come expecting civilians. What they were about to meet instead was something far more dangerous. 3,000 veterans. With 4 hours to prepare. The tunnels beneath Hian Reach had never been meant for war. They had been built for storage. For water lines. For power relays and irrigation systems. For the dull, necessary infrastructure that made life on a frontier moon possible. That had been the official design. Over the last 12 years, Petra Solis had made certain adjustments. Now those adjustments were about to become extremely useful. The underground network ran in 3 main levels beneath the colony. The first level held the original utility corridors and equipment rooms. The second level had been expanded slowly over the years, reinforced passages connecting the foundations of every major building on the surface. The third level was Petra's work. A deeper ring of chambers with thicker walls, independent power loops, and air recyclers capable of running for months without surface input. When the evacuation began, the entire population of Hian Reach disappeared into that network with remarkable efficiency. Within 40 minutes, the surface of the colony was empty. No people. No movement. Just the quiet buildings of a retirement settlement waiting beneath the morning sun. Below ground, the colony had become something else entirely. Petra stood in the engineering hub surrounded by half a dozen former technicians and shipbuilders. Holographic schematics filled the air above the central table. She pointed to a cluster of heavy equipment icons. Mining rigs, she said. 14 industrial drills used for mineral extraction in the valley's deeper rock layers. Each machine weighed several tons and was designed to drive through dense stone with enormous mechanical force. They had never been intended to move vertically. Petra had fixed that problem 2 hours ago. Reposition them beneath the eastern approach, she said. Redirect the drive shafts upward. One of the technicians raised an eyebrow. That'll tear the surface open. Petra nodded. That's the idea. Across the room, Yuta Karan reviewed the tunnel access points. Each building on the surface connected to at least one underground passage. Some connected to 3 hidden hatches, maintenance doors, ventilation shafts large enough for a person to crawl through. Most of them had been disguised carefully during Petra's upgrades. Strike teams will use these, Yuta said. She tapped several points along the central path. When the landing force spreads out, we come up behind them. Someone asked how many teams she planned to deploy. Yuta considered. Enough. Nearby, 2 elderly men sat cross-legged beside a crate of industrial explosives. Bowen and Fitch. Both in their late 80s. Both former demolition experts from the colonial expansion era. For the last decade, they had spent most afternoons playing chess near the lake. Now they were sorting shaped charges with the quiet concentration of surgeons preparing instruments. Fuse lengths? Bowen asked. 2 seconds, Fitch replied. Short. Fast problems require fast solutions. They continued working. Neither of them looked particularly excited, but both of them looked extremely pleased to have something useful to do. In another section of the tunnels, a team of drone specialists worked quickly. 42 survey drones had been stored in the colony maintenance depot. They were small, fragile, designed for atmospheric mapping and agricultural monitoring. They were not weapons, but they could carry additional payloads. And they could fly. Load signal transmitters, one technician said. Maximum broadcast output. Another nodded. Electronic noise? Everything they've got. Within minutes, the drones were being modified to emit every kind of electromagnetic signal their systems could produce. Radar, communications bursts, thermal signatures. To the sensors of a warship's defense grid, they would look like incoming threats. Not dangerous ones, but numerous ones. Dr. Elias Morn walked through the medical bay checking supplies. Surgical tools, bandages, pain suppressants, emergency blood packs. 8 medical personnel worked around him with quiet coordination. They had done this before. Not here. Not on this moon. But somewhere else. Somewhere worse. Remember, Elias said calmly, we treat everyone. One of the nurses nodded. Even them? Elias glanced at her. Especially them. She understood. Because the people who had lived through the worst wars tended to remember that humanity did not stop existing just because someone wore a different uniform. Meanwhile, Admiral Drays continued studying the orbital display. The Veery fleet had entered the system fully now. Their formation was precise. Professional. 3 heavy bombardment cruisers. 9 escort vessels. 12 landing transports already preparing descent. Drays watched the pattern for several minutes. Then he began sketching trajectories on his data pad. What are you calculating? Someone asked. He did not look up. Possibilities. Above them, the first Veery ships reached orbital range. Their weapon systems began charging. The fleet admiral had already issued the order. Standard doctrine. Orbital bombardment to soften the target. Energy signatures built across the hulls of the cruisers. Down in the tunnels, Petra watched the power readings climb on her monitor. They're getting ready, she said. Mara nodded. How long? 20 minutes. That was enough time. Enough time for the final preparations. Enough time to finish turning a quiet retirement colony into something the Veery Dominion had never imagined facing. Yuta returned to the central operations room. All strike teams ready, she reported. How many? Marist. 42 teams. Mara considered the number. That's a lot of retirees. Yuta shrugged slightly. We had good recruitment. In the drone bay, the final modifications were complete. The small machines lifted from the floor one by one, their engines humming softly. They looked harmless, tiny, insignificant, but there were dozens of them, and soon they would fill the sky. Petra checked the mining rig controls one last time. The drill heads now pointed straight up beneath carefully selected sections of the colony surface. She smiled again. Let's see if 12 years of preparation was excessive, she muttered. Above ground, the sunlight still touched the terraces of Hian Reach. The gardens, the empty paths, the quiet houses. Everything looked peaceful, abandoned, helpless. Exactly the way the Veery intelligence reports had predicted. The first bombardment cruisers aligned their weapons. And deep below the colony, 3,000 elderly humans waited calmly in the dark. Their trap was ready. All they needed now was for the invaders to walk into it. The first bombardment began exactly as Admiral Tarek's soul had ordered it. Precise, controlled, professional. High above Cathra 4, 3 Veery cruisers rotated slowly into firing position while the rest of the fleet widened its formation to maintain orbital dominance. Their weapon arrays glowed faintly along the hulls, gathering power in steady pulses. From space, Hian Reach looked small. A quiet scattering of buildings in a green valley. No shield network. No defensive batteries. No fleet presence. Nothing that should have required serious firepower. The Admiral intended to keep the strike minimal. Just enough to collapse infrastructure. Just enough to remove any possibility of resistance. Just enough to remind the colony that surrender was the most sensible option. Fire, he said. The first strike hit the central hull. From orbit it appeared as a brief flash of white energy. On the ground it was something else entirely. The beam struck the roof of the structure with a roar like thunder tearing the sky apart. Stone shattered. Solar glass exploded outward in glittering fragments. The roof collapsed inward as the supporting beams vaporized in an instant. Dust and debris rolled across the empty courtyard. The second strike followed seconds later. Residential buildings along the eastern terrace crumpled as the ground beneath them split and buckled. The stone paths cracked like dry clay. The gardens Mara had planted only hours earlier vanished beneath falling rubble and drifting ash. Another strike took the solar array on the ridge. Panels disintegrated in a wave of heat and light. Energy readings across the colony surface dropped instantly. The bombardment lasted 6 minutes. Not long. Just long enough. When it ended, Hian Reach looked broken. From orbit, the settlement resembled a cluster of ruins scattered across the valley floor. Buildings collapsed or burning. Paths shattered. Gardens buried beneath dust and debris. Exactly what the Veery fleet expected to see. Deep underground, the tunnels shook. Dust drifted down from the ceiling in thin gray clouds. Lights flickered once. Then steadied. The reinforced walls held. Petra watched the structural stress readings scroll across her monitor. Foundation stable, she said. Pressure within tolerance. Around her, engineers checked additional systems. Air recyclers still running. Backup power holding. Tunnel supports intact. The colony had taken damage. Serious damage. But the people inside the tunnels remained safe. 3,000 residents sat quietly in the underground chambers while the bombardment continued above them. Some held cups of tea. Some played cards. Some simply waited. Nobody panicked. They had all been through bombardments before. This one was comparatively polite. Cormac Drays watched the orbital data feed from the communications room. The bombardment cruisers had completed their firing cycle. Energy output declining. Landing transports preparing descent. He nodded slowly. Predictable, he murmured. What is? Someone asked. The commander above us. Drays gestured toward the display. He believes this phase of the operation is complete. The younger technician beside him frowned. It isn't? Drays smiled faintly. No. On the surface, the smoke from the bombardment drifted across the ruined colony. Dust settled slowly over shattered terraces. Wind carried the smell of scorched stone through the valley. When the first Veery landing transports descended through the clouds of debris, their pilots saw exactly what they expected. Destruction. Empty buildings. No movement. No survivors. The transports touched down across the valley in a carefully spaced formation. Armored personnel carriers rolled down the ramps. 4,000 Veery soldiers deployed quickly, forming defensive perimeters around the landing zones. Their scanners swept the ruined colony. Thermal signatures, none. Movement, none. Life signs, none. One lieutenant stepped forward beside the wreckage of the common hull. He studied the empty valley through his visor. Area appears abandoned, he reported into his communicator. Possible civilian evacuation before bombardment. High above the moon, Admiral Tarek's soul received the report. Unlikely, he said calmly. The colony had insufficient time. Perhaps they fled underground, the lieutenant suggested. Search and confirm. Yes, Admiral. The lieutenant signaled his unit. Soldiers spread out along the broken paths. They moved carefully, scanning debris piles and collapsed buildings. But they found nothing. No people. No resistance. No defenders. Just ruins. Exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted. The lieutenant transmitted another message. Surface clear so far. The admiral nodded. Proceed to secure mineral extraction sites. The soldiers advanced deeper into the colony. Their formation relaxed slightly. Weapons still raised. But the tension of combat had begun to fade. Because every piece of evidence told them the same thing. The bombardment had worked. The colony had been neutralized. Below them, in the tunnels beneath the valley, Mara Voss watched the sensor feed quietly. Yuta stood beside her. They're spreading out, Yuta said. Good, Mara replied. The soldiers moved through the ruins above them. Step by step. Unit by unit. Exactly where the underground sensors predicted they would go. Exactly where the trap had been prepared. 3,000 retired humans waited silently in the dark beneath their feet. The Veery soldiers believed they were walking through the wreckage of a defeated colony. They did not realize they had just stepped into the center of the battlefield. Mara glanced at Yuta. Yuta nodded once. Everything was ready. And above them, the invaders continued moving deeper into the valley, confident that the hardest part of their mission was already finished. They were wrong. Very wrong. Because the battle for Hian Reach had not even begun yet, the Veery soldiers moved through the ruins with professional caution. Even a shattered colony could still hide dangers. Training demanded discipline until every structure had been checked and every access point cleared. Their formations advanced along the broken paths in 3 main columns, weapons raised, scanners sweeping through drifting dust. The valley was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. But not enough to trigger alarm. The lieutenant leading the eastern column stepped over a section of collapsed stone wall and scanned the surrounding terraces. His visor displayed nothing unusual. Thermal signatures were flat across the valley floor. The bombardment had burned most surfaces to the point where lingering heat signatures masked smaller readings. Continue forward, he ordered. His soldiers obeyed. They moved deeper into Hian Reach. The first sound came from beneath the ground. At first it was faint. A low grinding vibration. One soldier paused. Did you hear? The sentence ended abruptly. The ground beneath the eastern column erupted. 4 mining drill heads burst upward through the shattered soil like enormous metal spears. Each one drove through the surface with the full redirected force of machines designed to chew through bedrock. The effect was immediate. One armored carrier flipped sideways and crashed into a ruined wall. Another was lifted entirely off the ground before slamming back down in a twisted heap. Several Veery soldiers were thrown through the air by the violent shockwave. The valley exploded into noise. Dust clouds surged upward. Stone fragments scattered across the path. Within 6 seconds, the eastern formation had lost nearly a third of its vehicles. And its composure. The soldiers reacted quickly. Training took over. Units spread out. Weapons came up. Targets searched. But the attack had not come from an enemy line. It had come from the ground itself. Before the lieutenant could issue new orders, the second part of the trap activated. Along the central terrace path, 8 hidden access hatches slid open beneath piles of debris. Human figures emerged from the tunnels. They moved calmly, not rushing, not shouting, each pair covering the other as they advanced through the drifting dust. They were old. The Veery soldiers could see that clearly through their visor magnification. White hair. Slow movements. Several leaned slightly on mechanical support frames. One woman carried a rifle with a prosthetic arm that clicked softly as she adjusted her grip. Yet something about the way they moved was wrong. They moved with precision. The first shots were fired. They did not miss. 3 Veery soldiers fell before the lieutenant even located the attackers. Another dropped seconds later as a shot struck the exposed joint of his armor. The human teams did not waste ammunition. Every shot had purpose. Every movement was controlled. They advanced slowly through the ruins, forcing the Veery formation to turn and divide its attention. The lieutenant shouted orders. Flank the left side. His soldiers tried. But every time a squad moved toward the attackers were already somewhere else. Because the humans knew the terrain. Every broken wall. Every collapsed terrace. Every concealed tunnel exit. They moved through the battlefield the way hunters move through forests they have walked their entire lives. The Veery soldiers, by contrast, were strangers here. Below ground, Yuta Karan watched the fight through the sensor grid. Her teams moved exactly as briefed. Small groups. Short engagements. Strike, disappear, reposition. She tapped a control pad on her forearm. 2 teams received the signal instantly. They shifted to intercept a Veery unit attempting to regroup near the landing zone. Yuta continued walking through the tunnel network with calm, efficient strides. She was not needed on the surface. Her job was coordination, and she was very good at it. In another tunnel junction, Bowen and Fitch crouched beside their explosive charges. A sensor display blinked softly between them. Wait, Bowen said. The Veery armored carriers above the landing zone were still repositioning. Fitch nodded. Another 10 seconds. They watched the sensor dots move closer together. Then Bowen raised 2 fingers. Now. Fitch pressed the detonator. The explosion beneath the landing site lifted an entire section of ground. 3 armored carriers were thrown sideways as the blast collapsed the soil beneath them. The landing zone vanished in a cloud of debris and fire. For the Veery soldiers on the surface, the situation changed from confusing to catastrophic. Communications filled with urgent reports. Ambush. Hostiles emerging from underground. Explosives at the landing zone. The lieutenant tried to regain control. But every time he formed a defensive line, another human strike team appeared from a different direction. They were not faster than his soldiers. They were not stronger. They were simply better at this. Because many of them had spent entire careers fighting battles exactly like this one. In the medical bay below, Dr. Elias Morn received the first injured colonists. A man with a fractured shoulder. A woman whose mobility frame had been damaged by falling debris. Elias worked steadily. His voice remained calm. Hold still. Breathe slowly. You'll be fine. The medical team moved around him with practiced coordination. Because war might have returned to Hian Reach. But medicine had never truly left it. Above them, the Veery soldiers were losing ground. The valley that had looked empty now seemed filled with enemies. Every ruined building hid a firing position. Every patch of broken earth concealed a tunnel exit. Every time they attempted to regroup, the humans struck again from another angle. Not recklessly, methodically. The lieutenant tried to call for support from orbit. But even as he spoke, another report arrived. Fleet communications disrupted. He froze. Disrupted? Yes, sir. Signal interference across multiple frequencies. Deep in the tunnels, Petra Solis watched the atmospheric processors activate. 3 enormous machines began pumping thick chemical mist through the colony's ventilation outlets. The fog spread quickly across the valley floor. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 4 meters. The Veery soldiers were blind. The humans were not. They had walked these paths for years. Mara Voss stood in the operations room watching the sensor display. Dots representing Veery soldiers moved in confused clusters. Dots representing human teams moved with quiet precision. She had seen this moment before. Many times. The instant when a confident invasion force realized it had walked into something it did not understand. She pressed the communication channel. "Continue Phase 2, she said calmly. Above ground, the battle intensified. Below ground, 3,000 retirees kept working quietly. The Veery Dominion had come expecting civilians. Instead they had found veterans. And the worst part for them was this. The humans were only getting started. The Veery commander on the surface had stopped trying to understand the situation. Understanding required time. And time was something he no longer had. Reports flooded his command channel in a constant stream of overlapping voices. Third unit pinned down. Eastern formation taking fire from multiple directions. Hostiles using subterranean movement. Visibility dropping across the entire valley. The fog that had begun creeping across the battlefield had thickened rapidly. The chemical mist settled close to the ground, heavy and metallic in smell, turning the ruined terraces of Hian Reach into a gray maze where nothing could be seen clearly beyond a few meters. For the Veery soldiers, it was chaos. For the humans, it was merely inconvenient weather. They knew the terrain by memory. They knew the tunnel exits. They knew exactly where each broken wall and collapsed path lay beneath the fog. The battle was no longer a landing operation. It had become a hunt. And the Veery were not the hunters anymore. Far above the moon, the Dominion fleet watched the battle unfold through orbital sensors. At first the reports from the landing commander had sounded routine. Minor resistance. Unexpected structural hazards. Possible survivors. But as the casualty numbers continued climbing, Admiral Terek's soul felt something cold settle behind his calm expression. He had launched 4,000 soldiers onto the surface of a retirement colony. They were losing. The Admiral studied the tactical display again. The surface fog now obscured most visual readings. Communications interference filled several bandwidths. Ground units reported attackers appearing and disappearing without clear origin. That should have been impossible. The colony possessed no military installations. No weapons platforms. No trained soldiers. Yet the battle reports described coordinated ambushes, precision fire, and movement patterns consistent with elite infantry tactics. Terek read the intelligence file again. Retirement colony. Average age 78. Minimal threat. He looked back at the casualty numbers. They were no longer minimal. In the communications chamber beneath Hian Reach, Admiral Drays leaned over the console quietly. He had activated a system Petra installed years earlier. The colony's long-range communications array. But instead of keeping the signal private, he had done something very deliberate. He had opened it. Every sensor feed. Every battle report. Every orbital scan. Everything happening in the valley was being broadcast across open galactic frequencies. Neutral relay stations were receiving the transmission. Trade vessels passing through neighboring systems were receiving it. The Galactic Assembly Network was receiving it. Within hours, half the region would know exactly what was happening here. Drays adjusted the transmitter settings slightly. Transparency, he murmured. An underrated tactical tool. Back in the engineering hub, Petra Solis looked up from her console. "You're broadcasting the battle?" she asked. Drays nodded. "Yes." "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because the Veery Dominion arrived believing no one would notice what they were doing." He tapped the console again. "Now everyone will." Petra considered that. Then she nodded. "Efficient." Above them, the Veery fleet had begun repositioning. Admiral Terek's soul was no longer confident this operation would end quickly. His landing force had encountered resistance far beyond expectations. The fog on the surface made precise targeting difficult. But one option remained. Standard escalation protocol. He turned toward his tactical officer. "Prepare a second bombardment." The officer hesitated. "Our troops are still on the surface. They will withdraw." Terek's voice remained calm. "This colony is proving inconvenient." The tactical officer nodded slowly. 3 heavy cruisers began rotating into new firing alignment. This bombardment would not be precise. It would not be limited. It would remove the entire surface of Hian Reach. Deep in the tunnels, the satellite monitoring system detected the change instantly. Energy readings from the fleet spiked sharply. Cormac Drays saw it first. His eyes narrowed slightly. He said. The technician beside him looked up. What is it? Drays picked up his communicator. They're preparing a second bombardment. How long? 30 minutes. In the operations room, Mara listened to the report quietly. 30 minutes. That meant the surface battlefield would soon become irrelevant. If the fleet fired again, even Petra's reinforced tunnels would not survive prolonged bombardment from 3 cruisers. The room fell silent. Yuta folded her arms. Petra took a slow sip of coffee. Drays studied the fleet map. Nobody panicked. They simply thought. Finally Petra set her cup down. I've been waiting for this part, she said. Everyone looked at her. She activated a schematic on the central display. It showed the industrial infrastructure of Cathra 4. Mining facilities. Or processing stations. Launch rails. Large electromagnetic launchers used to send mineral canisters into orbit where freighters collected them. 8 of them positioned across the valley. Drays leaned closer to the screen. Those are industrial railguns, he said. Petra nodded. They accelerate 2-ton or containers into low orbit. Drays began calculating immediately. His stylus moved across the data pad with quick, precise strokes. You're thinking of firing them at the fleet? Yes. They aren't targeting weapons. I know. They're designed for stationary cargo launches. I know. Drays continued working through the math. Finally he looked up. If we adjust the launch angles and time the trajectories. Petra finished the sentence. They'll intersect with the fleet. A technician stared at the screen. You're going to throw rocks at warships. Petra shrugged. Very fast rocks. Yuta stepped closer to the table. Fleet defenses will shoot them down. Some of them, Drays said. He pointed to another section of the schematic. Not if we give their targeting systems something else to worry about. The drone bay sat directly below that display. 42 survey drones waited on their launch platforms. Yuta nodded slowly. They go first. Exactly, Drays said. The plan formed quickly. Drone swarms to overwhelm point defense systems. Or canisters fired seconds later on intercept trajectories. Unguided. Imprecise. But massive. And moving at tremendous speed. Drays finished the calculations. 6 firing solutions appeared on the display. 3 bombardment cruisers. 3 escort ships. 2 high probability, he said. For moderate. Petra smiled. Good enough. Above the moon, the Veery fleet continued preparing its second strike. Admiral Tarek's soul believed he was about to erase a stubborn colony from existence. He had no idea that the colony beneath him had just decided to attack back. Not with warships. Not with missiles. But with the tools it used every day to move rocks. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the universe is not the one designed for war. It is the one designed for work. And the Veery Dominion was about to discover exactly how dangerous human engineering could be. The drone launch began 5 minutes later. Across the shattered surface of Hian Reach, concealed hatches slid open between broken stone and collapsed garden walls. From inside them, the first survey drones lifted into the morning air. They rose slowly at first. Then faster. 42 small machines climbed away from the ruins of the colony, spreading outward as they ascended toward orbit. From the ground they looked harmless. Tiny. Almost delicate. Their frames were built for agricultural mapping and atmospheric sampling, not combat. Their motors hummed softly as they formed loose groups and accelerated upward. But each drone had been modified. Every transmitter it carried was broadcasting at maximum output. Radar bursts. Communication pulses. Power spikes. Thermal signatures. To the Veery fleet's defense systems, the swarm looked like a cluster of incoming objects with wildly unpredictable signal profiles. Which meant the defense grid did exactly what it had been designed to do. It began shooting. High above Cathra 4, automated point defense cannons erupted into motion. Dozens of small targeting turrets along the hulls of the Veery warships tracked the incoming signals and opened fire. Streams of rapid kinetic rounds and directed energy pulses cut through space. The first drone vanished in a burst of fragments. The second followed seconds later. Then a third. More defense turrets activated. More tracking systems engaged. Within moments, the sky above the moon filled with defensive fire. The drones were dying quickly. They had never been meant to survive. They were meant to be numerous and distracting. Inside the communications chamber beneath the colony, Drays watched the defensive fire patterns form across the tactical display. "Good," he murmured. He checked the timing once more. The drone swarm had triggered nearly every point defense grid across the fleet. The systems were working hard, tracking dozens of targets simultaneously, consuming ammunition, adjusting targeting priorities, which meant that for the next few seconds, their attention would be divided. Drays lifted his communicator. "Petra," he said quietly. "Fire." Across the valley, 8 massive industrial launchers activated. These machines had originally been installed to send dense containers of raw mineral ore into low orbit for automated cargo collection. Each launcher used electromagnetic acceleration rails powerful enough to throw a 2-ton canister out of the moon's gravity well. They were not designed to be weapons. But Petra Solis had made several small adjustments to the targeting controls. Now they were aimed at the sky. The launchers fired. 8 concussive blasts shook the valley floor as the electromagnetic rails hurled their cargo upward. 2-ton ore containers shot into space like artillery shells. Solid, unguided, but extremely fast. The first canister missed. It passed harmlessly between 2 Veery escort ships and continued drifting into deep space. The second did not miss. It struck the midsection of a bombardment cruiser. There was no explosion. It was simply a massive piece of dense mineral traveling at enormous velocity. The impact cracked 3 layers of the cruiser's hull plating and punched through an internal structural frame before exiting the opposite side. Warning alarms flooded the ship. Drive systems shut down. The cruiser began drifting out of formation. The third and fourth canisters followed seconds later. Both were aimed at the second bombardment vessel. One slammed into the forward weapons array, ripping half the battery assembly away from the hull. The other struck the rear engine housing. The ship did not break apart, but its engines died instantly. And without engines, it was no longer capable of bombardment. The fifth canister grazed an escort frigate. The impact sheared off its communications tower and sent fragments spinning into space. The sixth missed completely. The seventh struck the bow of the third bombardment cruiser. The dense ore container punched through the armored plating and vented several internal compartments into vacuum. Emergency systems activated. The cruiser began withdrawing from its firing position immediately. In less than 30 seconds, 3 of the fleet's 12 warships were crippled. 2 were severely damaged. 1 had lost its weapons capability entirely. And the planned second bombardment evaporated instantly. On the command deck of the Vicus Uran, Admiral Terex Sol stared at the tactical display in disbelief. "Report," he demanded. His officers were already shouting across the bridge. "Cruiser Valith losing propulsion. Second bombardment ship offline. Structural breaches across multiple compartments." Another officer spoke up, confusion clear in his voice. "Admiral, we are registering impacts from surface-launched mass objects." Terex turned slowly. "Surface-launched?" "Yes." The officer magnified the data feed. Trajectory paths appeared across the screen. Origin point, Hian Reach colony. Projectile type, unidentified industrial mass. The Admiral's expression hardened. "They attacked the fleet," he said quietly. Back in the communications chamber, Drays watched the damage reports scroll across his screen. He marked 3 small symbols beside the fleet formation. 3 confirmed hits, he said. A technician nearby stared at the display. "You just damaged a war fleet with mining equipment." Drays considered that. Then he nodded slightly. Engineering has always been a very persuasive argument. On the surface below, the Veery soldiers received the news through their comms. Their fleet, invulnerable moments ago, had taken damage. From the colony they had been sent to occupy. The psychological effect was immediate. The soldiers who had been fighting cautiously now fought uncertainly. The assumption of overwhelming superiority had vanished. And without that assumption, their situation looked very different. They were on unfamiliar terrain, surrounded by enemies who seemed to know every inch of the battlefield. And now the ships above them, the ships that were supposed to guarantee victory, were no longer untouchable. The confidence that had carried the invasion forward cracked. Just like the hull of the bombardment cruiser. Deep in the tunnels, Mara watched the sensor feeds update. The Veery ground formations were already pulling back toward their landing zones. The balance of the battle had shifted. Not completely, but enough. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not in relief, just in recognition. The tide had turned. Then she opened them again. Prepare for withdrawal phase, she said, because the fight was not finished yet. But from this point forward, the Veery Dominion would no longer be advancing. They would be trying to escape. And 3,000 retired humans were very good at making sure their enemies never left easily. The turning point of the battle was quiet. There was no single explosion that ended it. No dramatic charge across the ruins. Instead, the fight simply changed direction. On the surface of Hian Reach, the Veery landing commander watched the reports arriving on his visor display. His eastern units were scattered. His landing zone had partially collapsed. Visibility across the battlefield had been reduced to a gray haze. And now the fleet above him, the fleet that was supposed to guarantee victory, was reporting serious damage. He had 4,000 soldiers on the ground. He had begun the mission with complete confidence. Now he studied the tactical map and realized something unsettling. His forces were no longer advancing. They were trying to survive. The fog drifting through the ruins thickened as the atmospheric processors continued pumping their heavy chemical mist across the valley floor. The humans moved through it like ghosts. Small teams appearing from tunnel exits, striking isolated Veery squads, then vanishing again before the soldiers could organize a counterattack. Every attempt to regroup was interrupted. Every attempt to secure ground was slowly eroded. The humans were not rushing. They were not shouting. They simply kept working. Slow, steady, unstoppable. The kind of fighting that comes from decades of experience rather than adrenaline. High above the moon, Admiral Tarek's soul watched his fleet struggling to stabilize formation. 3 ships damaged. 2 of them unable to continue bombardment. Communications disrupted. Drone interference still lingering across several targeting systems. The tactical picture had changed completely. He had arrived expecting a minor occupation operation. Instead, he was losing ships to a colony armed with industrial equipment. For the first time in the campaign, the Admiral allowed himself to consider the possibility that the intelligence report had been catastrophically wrong. He issued the order quietly. Prepare fleet withdrawal. His officers hesitated only a moment before acknowledging. On the surface, the Veery landing commander received the message seconds later. His eyes moved slowly across the battlefield. Ruined buildings. Human figures moving through the mist with calm precision. He had lost hundreds of soldiers already. And the humans showed no sign of slowing down. He made the decision that professional soldiers sometimes must make. He opened the command channel. All units fall back to landing perimeter. His voice carried across the ruined valley. Prepare for extraction. But even withdrawal proved difficult, because the humans had planned for that as well. Yuda's teams shifted positions immediately. They did not chase. They did not rush. They simply tightened the perimeter around the landing zone, forcing the Veery soldiers to move carefully through the fog toward their transports. By the time the first evacuation craft lifted from the surface, the Veery commander understood something with painful clarity. He was not fighting civilians. He was fighting veterans. And veterans rarely allowed easy victories. The surrender signal came shortly before midday. Not with ceremony. Not with speeches. Just a simple encrypted transmission from the Veery command channel. Ceasefire. Negotiating withdrawal. the valley fell quiet. Human teams lowered their weapons. Yuta's units emerged from the fog and began collecting abandoned rifles and equipment from the battlefield. The Veery soldiers who remained laid down their weapons one by one. None of them argued. None of them resisted. They had fought well. But the people who defeated them had been fighting wars since before many of them were born. Above the moon, the damaged Veery fleet withdrew slowly toward the system's outer jump point. 2 crippled cruisers had to be towed by escort ships. The entire formation moved away from Cathra 4 in embarrassed silence. They had come to seize a colony. Instead they left behind destroyed equipment, hundreds of casualties, and a story that would spread across half the galaxy before their ships even reached home. Because Admiral Dreis had not turned off the broadcast. For the last hour of the battle, every moment had been transmitted across open communication channels. Every maneuver, every strike, every impact. The entire invasion had been witnessed by anyone listening. And many had been listening. 3 days later, the first outside ships arrived in the system. News vessels. Inspection craft. Observers from neutral governments. They expected to find chaos. They expected wounded colonists and frightened civilians. Instead they found something much quieter. Hian Reach was already rebuilding. The surface still showed the scars of the bombardment. Collapsed structures. Broken terraces. But the people living there were working calmly through the repairs. Garden soil was being cleared. Stone paths reset. Drone crews repairing damaged irrigation lines. Life returning to routine. Dr. Elias Morn was the first resident the journalists interviewed. He sat in a chair outside the temporary medical bay with a cup of tea resting in his hands. One reporter asked carefully, "Doctor, what was it like defending the colony at your age?" Elias thought about the question. Then he smiled. "Honestly," he said, "my hip caused me more trouble than the Veery did." The reporters laughed. But they also wrote the line down very carefully. Because they knew they had just heard something people would repeat for years. Yuta Karan refused all interviews. She had already returned to her morning exercise routine. When one young Galactic Assembly officer asked her about the tunnel tactics she had used during the battle, she answered simply, "That's how we handled situations like this 30 years ago." The officer blinked. "You've done this before?" Yuta shrugged slightly. "Something similar." Then she finished her exercises and walked away. Petra Solis had already submitted a 14-page engineering report to the Human Colonial Authority describing how industrial or launchers could be adapted for orbital defense. At the end of the report she added a note. With additional materials and 6 weeks of work, the targeting system could be significantly improved. Good design, she wrote, was always useful in more situations than originally intended. Cormac Dreis returned to the lake. His chair had survived the bombardment untouched. So had the thermos. He set the new fishing rod beside him, the one delivered 2 days later by an automated courier drone. The note attached to it read, "Outstanding work, Admiral. Crew of the CNS Harrier." Dreis read the note once. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He cast his line across the water and spent the rest of the morning fishing. The story of Hian Reach spread quickly across the galaxy. Some told it as a military lesson, some as a humorous story about invaders defeated by retirees, others as a warning about underestimating humans. But every version contained the same essential truth. A powerful fleet had attacked what it believed to be a harmless retirement colony. And it had discovered, far too late, that experience does not disappear with age. Weeks later, Mara Voss returned to her garden. Much of it had been buried during the bombardment. But one corner had survived. The soil was still dark and fertile. She knelt slowly and brushed aside the loose dirt. The seeds she had planted that morning before the attack were still there. Waiting. A young colonist named Myra sat beside her. "Were you afraid?" Myra asked quietly. Mara considered the question. Then she shook her head. "No." "What were you feeling?" Mara pressed her fingers gently into the soil. "Angry." Myra looked surprised. "Angry?" Mara nodded. "Fear freezes you." She looked up at the peaceful sky above the valley. "Anger reminds you what you're protecting." She covered the seeds carefully. Above them, the birds had returned to the trees. The sky was pale blue again. Quiet. Halcyon Reach had been broken. But it had never been defeated. And anyone in the galaxy thinking about attacking another human retirement colony would remember that. Because sometimes the most dangerous people in the universe are the ones who have already spent their entire lives surviving war and were finally hoping to rest.